Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the Middle Ages, right? Picking up right where we left off in class last time when we were talking about Gothic architecture, PP. Now, the biggest thing about it, though, okay, we are exactly going to pick up right where we left off from our last class, continuing our discussion of the High Middle Ages in particular, right? Talking about the transfer and the focusing in on the transference of the early Middle Ages, where we are recollecting ourselves after the fall of Rome, and now we're actually transferring over into the High Middle Ages, up close and personal, big fella. It's like now into the High Middle Ages where things are beginning to redevelop, and one of our best examples of this is we were talking about the growth of the Catholic Church, right? We were talking about the growth of the Catholic Church, its dominance, its creation, and its expansion throughout most of Europe, right? Now, the other big thing that we need to focus in on when we're talking about the growth of the Catholic Church, though, is we focused on Gothic architecture as a symbol of that growth, right? We talked about rose windows, stained glass windows, everything comes to a point, flying buttresses, ha 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 ha. Talked about vaulted ceilings, gargoyles, all that fun stuff, right? Now, the biggest thing that we need to do, though, is continue to roll forward and talk about how these churches, right, particularly these cathedrals, are going to continue to grow not only in size, but in influence as well, right? And the particular way that they grew in influence more than anything else is that these cathedrals and these large city churches, while the people outside mow my grass, turned into what is known as monasteries and convents, right? Now, as these cathedrals, as these churches began to grow in size, they began to also grow in personnel, if you will, right? What a monastery or a convent is, just to give you kind of a semblance of understanding, is a very large church where monks and nuns go, where they can dedicate their life to faith and study. These monasteries would house the very first very large libraries during the Middle Ages and grow into what is known as universities, right? Now, look, first of all, just so we know, they didn't come up with this idea originally, right? The Catholic priests and nuns and monks and nuns did not invent the concept of universities. That was actually invented by the Muslim kingdoms during the Eastern Golden Age or the Monsoon Marketplace, right? They're the ones who actually developed the idea of centers of learning like that, right? But the Europeans are going to make their own version of it after actually interacting with the Muslims and a little bit of cultural diffusion there, and they're going to grow it out of particularly the Catholic Church realm. Now, why really quickly would you focus on the growth of intelligence and what's the word I'm looking for? The intelligence and the reemergence of literature and literacy in these places? Well, they don't seem like places that they would actually start growing out of, because you're literally there taking vows of labor, silence, and writing, right? So monks and nuns, while working at these monasteries, right, while studying these religious and holy texts, would take these really intense vows of labor, where they would work a certain amount of time during the day. They would take vows of silence, where they would think introspectively and not speak to anyone, and they would pray throughout the day. And then also they would take vows of writing, right, as another form of their labor. What a lot of these monks and nuns typically did was they copied manuscripts, right, and copied Bibles and copied holy texts from one location to the other, all right? This is basically how in Europe most books were produced during the Middle Ages, right? It's through these monks and nuns. Now, the sad part about it is though, even though they were trying their best to preserve the written word, to grow the written word in a sense, and to keep expanding the volume of books and texts that they have, it is going to lead to the loss of a lot of Roman writings, right? Mostly due to the fact that the only things that these monks and nuns were actually copying over from one location to the other were holy and religious texts, right? Dialogues from apostles, dialogues or books from the early versions of the Bible, like reflections of other monks and nuns on things. For example, St. Thomas Aquinas is going to be one of the famous monks to come out of the High Middle Ages, who's going to focus on reflections of things on the soul, even though you could possibly relate him to the Renaissance if you wanted to. But when they were doing this, they actually had to scrape a lot of these old hides and a lot of these old pieces of paper and actually clean them off, and they actually had old Roman writing on them, right? And so we actually lost a lot of Roman writings to this process. But also going into it, if monks are the ones actually creating these books and handwriting them from one location over to the other, what is this going to do to the price of books? Well, it actually makes them insanely expensive, right? So they're insanely expensive due to the fact that they all had to be handwritten, they were all hand decorated, they were also all hand illustrated, and they also took a lot of time to make, right? And also you got to remember as well as the supply of them is very low, which is going to make the demand of them very, very high, right? right? So while these monks and nuns and stuff like that are actually focusing in on it, these places do become centers of learning, right? And they actually do eventually grow into those first universities. Now, the other big thing that's going to end up happening as well is that they're going to actually be heavily regulated, and some of the earliest structures of the faith are going to begin to pop up in this area, right? And so we actually see right around the 6th century, right, this guy named Saint Benedict shows up, who actually creates rules that regulate and govern monastic life, right? And the 6th century rules that the Saint Benedict came up with, known as the Benedictine rules, are going to be really, really big things on talking about how monks should actually focus on their vows of labor, how they should focus on their vows of silence, how they should all know how to read and write and be able to preach and teach at any given part of the day, right? Benedict's rules included things like that monks had to go to sleep with their entire garb on, so like if literally somebody needed some preaching or teaching at any moment, they could just jump out of bed and get after it, right? They also had to sleep with a light on. There was regulations on certain animals they could or could not eat. But right around later on, like right around the thousands AD, 3 more would be added, right? And those are the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, right? Now, these rules are going to be very interesting going on a little bit later, because by the 1500s, a lot of these rules start getting violated, right? Poverty being the fact that they are not out there to try and make money, they are simply out there to try and preach the word of Christ and stuff like that, right? Well, this is going to get violated when a lot of popes start making a buttload of money, right? And then also vows of chastity, where we're going to see like a lot of priests that they have to make sure that they are staying chaste, and they are like staying unwed, and they are focusing on the words of God and stuff like that. This gets violated as well when, like, particularly like Pope Julius II, the Pope, Pope Julius II dies from syphilis. And then also going into it as well, vows of obedience to the church leaders, right? So it creates a very, very intense political structure. But these monasteries and convents are still really important because they're centers of learning, growth, and expansion during the Middle Ages in this area, right? Now, the church in politics, though, is going to be very important as well because their political presence is beginning to grow, right? Because of the effects of these monasteries, because of the effects of the growths of these universities, these early universities, drawing in a lot of attention and leading to the basically the birth of the Renaissance happened in some of these early monasteries. What's going to happen is because the church is becoming so important in society, it's beginning to take on some political roles as well, right? Popes began to compete with kings and governments for power. In the High Middle Ages, we're going to see the Pope rise up as one of the most dominant figures in all of history, right? And this will continue to rise forward all the way up until the 1500s when he gets into a little scuffle with this guy named Martin Luther, right? Now, going into it, though it ends up growing is this concept known as papal supremacy, where popes, kings, monks, not popes and kings, but popes and figures within the church, cardinals and bishops, okay? Not all of them began to exert this, but some of them began to exert their power over kings and governments by threatening leaders with faith-based punishments, right? Papal supremacy was basically this concept where popes invoked the idea that they were the supreme power in most parts of Europe because they could read, preach, and teach the Bible. And they also could judge you and then also condemn you to hell if they so chose, right? And they threatened kings that if they didn't fall into line and do what they told them to, then they might do things like excommunicate them. A good example of this is Henry IV, who is the king of the areas of the Holy Roman Empire, and Gregory VII, who was the pope at the time. And Gregory VII invoked a lot of papal suprematic power and a lot of papal supremacy at times, when sometimes he would even make people that came in to talk to him kiss his feet before they allowed anybody to speak to him. He also literally threatened Henry IV, saying, hey, if you do not do what I'm telling you to, and if you try to appoint your own bishops one more time, I'm going to freak out and excommunicate you. And he did. Gregory VII actually excommunicated a king of an entire country and said that this will fall onto your people as well if you continue this, forcing Henry IV to go back to Gregory VII and plead and beg for his forgiveness. And then Gregory made him wear a shirt made out of hair. That's a whole thing. It's supposed to be very uncomfortable and itchy. They did it to John the Baptist too. Now, going into it, though, punishments could be issued by the church on not only kings as well, but also as individuals, right? So what we were talking about with Henry IV, when he was excommunicated by the Pope, what that was known as is an interdiction, right? What an interdiction is when a king, leader, or a noble that is a landholder gets excommunicated by the church. And what that ends up doing is that not only excommunicates the entirety, all right, of their country, but also the people that live within it, right? And usually popes would do this to inspire rebellion or revolt, to try and lead to a new appointment of a figure within that area, or to try and create more political power and presence, right? Now, if you were to actually get rid of an individual, though, right, if one of you lashed out against the Pope or lashed out against your priest or lashed out against somebody anybody else. For example, like Martin Luther did in 1517 when he started the Protestant Reformation, which we're going to be talking about a lot very soon, and you will also be learning about in religion class. He was excommunicated for his like vendetta or his like issues with the church at the time, and for his writings, right? So excommunication is when you break up with someone who is now your ex, right? Get it? All right, you've been excommunicated from the church. An interdiction is when you get rid of an entire area, right? Now, there were also some really extreme punishments that the church could issue out. For example, the Inquisition and torture, right? The Middle Ages church was known for the occasional bout of torturing people, right? To try and get them to confess to crimes, right? Like people that might have been accused of being witches, or for example, also people accused of violating crimes against the church or against the faith, right? But the Inquisition is really, really important, okay? Now, the Inquisition is so important, in fact, because you need to know what it is, and it's going to pop up a lot of different times in history. But what the Inquisition is it's a church court, okay? Now, a church court, what I mean by that is they actually are basically the judge, jury, and executioner of an individual, right? So basically what ends up happening is they are a group of people that can convict suspected heretics or anybody who would speak out against the church. And if you spoke out against the church, you would be brought in front of a Inquisition. Now, there wasn't just one of them, right? This right here is a very famous moment in history where a very famous figure was brought in front of an Inquisition tribunal, and that guy's name is Galileo, right? Not Galileo, let me rephrase. Galileo is a real person, not just something that Freddie Mercury and his bandmates and Queen sang at the top of their lungs in Bohemian Rhapsody. Like, you have to understand that Galileo was a real guy. And since he actually spoke out against the church and he kind of defamated them a little bit when he was talking about how the planets move around the sun, not the other way around, what he does is he ends up getting called into an Inquisition. Now, he got called into one in Rome, but you could go to an Inquisition any place, any time. They had them all over the place, right? The Inquisition, though, is just basically putting somebody on trial for their faith-based infractions. Now, Galileo was threatened with either possible execution, which we'll get to that whole process here in a moment, or he could take back what he said and ended up under house arrest, right? So what he ended up doing is he took back everything he said and he ended up under house arrest until the day he died. But we'll talk about that whole story a little bit later on. Now, the church, though, to try and get you to confess, was well known at the time for enacting torture every now and again. They didn't do it all the time. A lot of people try to act like this happened every single time, but it didn't. But they did. There are cases of it, right? And just so you know, Pope Francis and other popes and other church figures have come out and apologized for this relentlessly. The modern day Catholic Church is no longer connected to torture, and they have recanted their ways of the past, right? Now, the thing about it, though, okay, this is a famous torture method that was used at the time known as the rack, where they would apparently stretch you. This one is called the strappado, when they would apparently put your hands behind your back, tie your hands together, and lift you off the ground on a pulley system, and then drop you back down to the ground until you confessed. And this one right here is known as Catholic water torture, right? So those torture methods were used to exact confessions for things you may or may not have done, and the one that was the absolute worst punishment you could get from an Inquisition was being executed. And the process that they did that by was known as burning at the stake, right? It was the most prevalent one. Now, going into it, though, all that stuff, that's all your stuff that you need to know about the growing Catholic Church, right? Focusing on the growth of monasteries and convents, or focusing on the political role of the church in the High Middle Ages, and how that will literally come into be a very big problem when we get to the 1500s, right? But now what we need to do is we need to turn our focus, though, back to more the cultural geography of Europe at the time, right? And in the High Middle Ages, what you're going to see happening is you're going to see some emerging kingdoms, right? You're going to start seeing, for the very first time in European history up to this point, you're going to start seeing kingdoms emerge, right? And some of y'all are like, but Mr. Terry, I thought we already talked about the Frankish kingdom under Clovis. And you know what, Claire? That's a great answer, and I agree. And I love how your voice apparently sounds like this. Now, the thing apparently, though, that you need to understand, you are right. We have talked about kingdoms already. But what's going to happen in the High Middle Ages is the number of them is going to grow much, much faster, right? And so the emerging kingdom that we're going to focus on as a good example of this is the growth of England, right? Now, really quickly, just so we understand, going into it, all right, from about 400 AD, from right around the fall of Rome to about 900 AD, England, or the country of England, right, or the United Kingdom that you know of it now, because it includes England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, right, included a lot of settling people, right? For example, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Danes, right? That's why England is called England, because for quite some time when the Romans would refer to it, they would call it Angle land, or the land of the Angles, and then later on in Old English and Old Anglo-Saxon English, they would also continue to refer to it themselves as Angles, or Angles, or the land of the Angles. And what would end up happening is in Old English, the letter was an A and that had an E on the side of it. And after a lot of time of demorphing that entire language, it turned into Angleland into Angland, or England, right? So the Angles and the Saxons were there, and there was also another group there as well. In the 400s to 900s, there was a very pesky group of the people known as the Danes, right? Now, the Danes is another very fun little name for those Vikings, right? The Vikings actually came in and settled this entire area right there. The entire time period was known as the Danelaw, or it's when literally the Danes and the Vikings actually settled a huge chunk of England, of what is now modern day England, and they kind of actually oppressed a lot of people, they murdered a lot of people, they ransacked a lot of stuff, and they actually really ended up forcing a cultural shift in England, right? Because it all came down to this one guy, Alfred the Great, who literally is a prominent character in a Netflix show, all right? There's a Netflix show called The Last Kingdom, when it talks about, Alfred the Great, his rise to prominence, and the Saxons and the Angles uniting together to fight those Danes off, right? He is basically the English version of Clovis, right? He's going to show up in the 800s AD, and he is going to unite all the nobles and lands underneath him to stop Viking invasions, right? So he is going to unite the Angles and Saxons together. He will eventually unite another kingdom known as Northumbria into the mix as well, and he will unite all these provinces together to push the Vikings out and begin a process of de-Vikinizing the area that you now know as England, right? And the three biggest effects of this is he unifies the Angles and Saxons underneath one common ground, and he begins to push the idea of a united Angland, right? Or in England, right? And he leads a process of unification. He also rids the English Isles of the Danish influence and then suppresses them so much to the point that they eventually start leaving. And also another really interesting fact as well is that Alfred the Great promoted literacy just like Charlemagne did in the Frankish kingdom, right? He is going to carry on this tradition. He's going to promote literacy, and he's going to invoke the concept of creating more monasteries, creating more convents, and creating more centers of this educational value. He himself was literate, and he believed that if you were going to work with him or for him, you must also be literate as well. So literacy will begin to grow back in England there, also leading to a growth in their power. Now, Alfred's descendants, though, later on are going to oust the Danes completely and unite England under one crown, right? And they're going to build a bunch of big walls and stuff like that that are going to keep the Vikings out and actually create new keeps and strongholds that are going to prevent later invasion. But then Alfred's great-great-great-grandson died with no heir to the throne, all right? Now, what we have on our hands at this point, when Alfred literally, who has united these people together and has begun to create the country of England, he ends up in what is known as a succession crisis. I know. All right, so yeah, what a succession crisis is, just so you understand it a little bit more effectively, is basically when an heir to the throne, or excuse me, when a person on the throne dies with no heir, right? And I don't mean heir like, not heir like that. I mean heir as in I have nobody to take the throne after I die, right? Because at the time, there was this old law in the books called Salic law that said no one, a woman could not inherit the throne, and two, no man could inherit the throne through a woman, right? And so what ends up going down, though, is his son, or his great-great-great-grandson, Edward, dies with no heir to the throne. He didn't have any children, and also he was married and stuff like that, but he also was super focused on his faith. Fun fact, some of you actually have probably heard of Edward before. Edward was also known as Edward the Confessor. He is the guy that actually created the position of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and also he built this church known as Westminster Abbey, right? He had that built as well as one of the largest monasteries early on in early England. And so that guy, Edward the Confessor, because he focused so much on his faith and not having kids, died with no kids left on the throne. So what happens whenever somebody dies with no heir left to the throne, and we'll go through a succession crisis in class, what ends up occurring is multiple people will claim the throne, right? And two people end up claiming, well, actually in real life, it's three people end up claiming the throne, because I can't lie to you, right? Like, y'all know me, you've met me now, right? You understand that Mr. Terry has a really big issue when it comes to leaving out details of the story, right? What ended up actually happening in real life is three different people claim the throne of England because there's an empty chair and they all want it, right? And this leads to a very long period of time known as the Norman Conquest of England, right? The claimants to the throne are going to be three different individuals. Two are important, Edward, one is not. All right, so now look. So one of them is a guy named Harold Godwinson, who is the son of one of Edward's advisors and who actually ends up getting crowned king in the process, right? So interesting little factor happens here. One of Edward the Confessor's advisors, right, a Godwinson, right, or Godwin, like is the guy's name, actually literally was told that he was supposed to inherit the throne, or that his son or descendants would, should Edward never have a child. So Harold Godwinson actually was crowned throne, but we have an issue, right? As Edward the Confessor was still ruling, apparently there was some confusion with this guy. There was another man named William of Normandy, right? William of Normandy claimed that Edward's archbishop said that Edward wanted him to be king, but there's a problem with this. William of Normandy claimed the throne for after Edward died because he was like, I know this because the archbishop told me so, right? And the thing about it is William of Normandy has a really big army, but the biggest reason why no one back in England wanted William of Normandy to have the throne is because he's French. He's French. He's from this area known as Normandy, which is in northern France, right? And then you have another guy named Harold Hardrada, who's not that important, and he's the king of Norway. So, but Harold Hardrada was like, I want it too, and then just also wanted to get involved in this entire thing as well. Well, what ends up happening, though, is, of course, a war, right? A war ends up happening that actually is fought between all three of these claimants to the throne, when, ironically enough, one guy had already been crowned king, all right? Harold Godwinson was crowned king already, and the only account of this entire war that we have in history is this thing called the Bayeux Tapestry, which is a 224-foot long thing that looks like this. I kid you not, it's literally a tapestry. It is a piece of cloth that has cross-stitched figures on it, and look how crusty it looks. Like, I've never been able to draw fingers my whole life, but that is a crusty-looking finger right there. So the thing about it, though, is the only account of that entire affair that we have is just that Bayeux Tapestry, right? It is super long, too. Like, look how long it is. It's the only documented evidence we have of the war between these three individuals, right? But what ends up going down, though, is that, oh no, don't you dare. What ends up going down, sorry about that. What ends up going down, though, is the Battle of Hastings in 1066 between the three claimants of the throne. Well, not technically, because what ended up happening, though, in the long run, is that a massive battle blew up between all three claimants to the throne, right? And, of the Anglo-Saxons, later on would be known as England, right? Harold, right, Godwinson, unfortunately could not fight both of these armies, right? What he ended up actually doing is he marched his entire army north to fight Harold Hardrada and the Norwegian army. He ends up beating them at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, but then he has to walk his entire army all the way back and then head off William of Normandy at the southern area of England, right? Because, of course, northern France is right there across the English Channel. Now, his forces are going to end up defeating Harold Hardrada, all right, who did die in that war, but also Harold Godwinson will die in this battle as well. At the Battle of Hastings in the southern area of England, Harold Godwinson gets shot in the eye with an arrow. So the guy that has been crowned king of England ends up shot in the face with an arrow, which is pretty rough and pretty crusty. Yeah, it is pretty cute, right? Hi, sweetheart. How are you? My wife just came back from getting coffee with her sister. Oh, look at that. Look at her. Hello, sweetheart. How are you?
I'm good. Is this Audrey's class?
This is Audrey's class, yeah.
Hi, Audrey. Nice to see you.
Yeah, let's see. She remembers you, Audrey. All right, now going into it, though, okay? His forces are going to end up defeating Harold Hardrada, yes, but what ends up happening, though, is he ends up losing to William of Normandy in the south, and William of Normandy will be crowned king a few months later on Christmas Day, and it leads to this event known as the Burning of London. But we'll explain all that stuff and talk about the major effects of this entire, movement and of this entire event in class. I want to see y'all tomorrow, okay? Y'all have a great one. See y'all soon.